with little shelter from the sun or rain, let alone medical support, and dysentery rife. People later said that they could smell the two boats long before they could see them at Basra. And when the medical team...
Oh, bro, that is...
1960.
Alright, suggestion to me, for me, by me. British defeat.
After 140 days, the besieged British and Indian garrison at Kut in modern-day Iraq surrendered to the Turks. It was the biggest surrender of British forces since Yorktown, 130 years beforehand. But why were the British there?
Yo, that's crazy. Freaking only 130 years since the American... What? 130 years after the American Revolution, we had World War... Wow.
Siege ended in defeat. And what happened to the garrison afterwards? The Siege of Kut took place during the First World War in Turkish Ottoman-controlled Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. The Ottomans entered the war on the German side, and a joint British-Indian army landed at Basra in Mesopotamia and advanced on Baghdad. Checked by Turkish forces just before the city, they fell back to the town of Kut, where they were besieged. Reduced to eating horse meat and eating weeds, suffering from starvation, scurvy and dysentery, they held out for 140 days. Attempts to break through to relieve them ended in failure, and over 23,000 casualties. The Siege of Kut also saw the very first attempt to airdrop supplies to a besieged garrison.
Oh wow.
But in the end, having lost 1,700
I just learned something new.
men either killed or to disease, British commander General Townsend surrendered his 9,000 men. That was 3,000 more than the British surrendered at Yorktown. Those prisoners now embarked on a horrific death march, in which 1,700 or 70%
Demonetized.
of the British troops died or were never heard of again, with at least 1,300 Indians suffering the same fate. This is...
Damn, bro. I can hear the ultra-nationalist Turks scrambling in my comments already. Oh, the cope. I mean, this video is suggested to me by a Turkish person, actually. Hilariously enough. Still, I'm gonna hear all the ultra-nationalist Turks in my comments in their freaking Berlin apartments typing like there's no tomorrow.
This is the story of Britain's disaster in the desert. In August 1914, at the outbreak of the First World War, the British landed a small force from the Indian Army at Abadan in Persia to protect her, and in particular the Royal Navy's, oil interests. However, when the Ottomans formally entered the war on the 30th of October, those oil fields were once more vulnerable to enemy forces in neighbouring Turkish-governed Mesopotamia. The British decided that the best way to protect those oil interests was to clear the Turks out of the south of the province. The ensuing military expedition came under the direction of the India Office and the British Indian Army, rather than the War Office in London. And therein lay its future problems. Most used to fighting tribes on the northwest frontier, the Indian Expeditionary Force was woefully unprepared for the campaign. Not that it seemed to matter at this particular moment, because the landing successfully overran the Turkish fort at Fao before capturing Basra on the 22nd of November. By Christmas, they'd advanced 50 miles inland to Korna at the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. With the reasonably easy success, a spirit of complacent optimism abounded within the British establishment in India. The Viceroy of India, Lord Hardinge, was keen to advance north and capture the ancient city of Baghdad, and his new military commander in Mesopotamia, General Sir John Nixon, agreed. In October 1915, and with the Turks' attention focused in Egypt, the Caucasus and Gallipoli, Nixon ordered General Charles Townsend to advance up the Tigris with the 6th Indian Pune Division.
So I didn't even know that it was Indians fighting here. I thought this was like purely Anglo, like Anglo-Briton force here. And when I say Briton, I mean like Celtic, because this is just a personal thing. I wouldn't even say a personal thing. I don't consider Anglo-Saxons to be Britons, because they're not indigenous to Britannia. I don't consider them to be Britons because of that. I consider the people who are actually indigenous to Britannia to be Britons, and that's not Anglo-Saxon. So yeah, you get used to me saying that. But I always thought it was like them doing that. I thought it was the Anglos and Britons fighting here. I didn't know that it was actually Indians. I know India had a big part in both world wars, don't get me wrong, but that's interesting. That is very interesting because it's like, it's a British defeat, but like, is it truly British though? Like, you know what I mean?
54-year-old Townsend had risen to prominence when he had successfully held out in the northwest frontier region of India during the siege of Chitral in 1895.
If a man really hated
His first objective was to capture the town of Kut before, if possible, to continue up the river to Baghdad itself. The 6th Division was a mixed force of Indian and British troops.
Okay, so it's mixed.
The British had never 100% trusted their Indian troops, and consequently, each Indian division had somewhere in the region of 20 to 25% of its strength made up from contingents from the regular British Army. In this case,
but it was still majority in the... Okay.
Troops were the 2nd Dorsets, the 2nd Norfolks, and the 1st Ox and Bucks Light Infantry. Meanwhile, the rest, and majority of the division, were made up of 9 Indian infantry regiments. Now, I've produced a list of them in the description, but they included the 117th Marathas, the 22nd Punjabis, and the 7th Rajputs. Also present were about 1,000 cavalry, plus contingents of the Royal Field Artillery, the Indian Artillery Brigade, sappers, pioneers. In total, Townsend's division consisted of about 12,000 fighting men. Having easily taken Kut, Townsend advanced all the way to Ctesiphon, about 30 miles south of Baghdad.
Wait,
There,
is that the old capital? Is that the old ancient Persian capital, Ctesiphon? Oh wait, that still existed? Is that it? Someone answered that for me. Is that actually... I thought Ctesiphon doesn't... So I could have sworn I read a comment that after the early Muslim expansion, Ctesiphon doesn't exist anymore.
he found the Turkish or Ottoman army waiting for him. And it was a very different army to the one that had been swatted aside at Basra the previous year. These Turks were German-trained and consisted of veterans from their recent success at Gallipoli. Moreover, they were well entrenched and outnumbered the British by nearly 2 to 1. The Battle of Ctesiphon on
You're attacking a defending army without outnumbering them. That's obviously going to end in disaster. Come on, everyone should know this. When you're an attacking force, you need to outnumber the enemy 3 to 1. I mean, extremely dumb by the British to allow that
the
to
23rd
continue.
of November 1915 was hard fought. After 6 hours, the Turkish front line was finally in British hands, but Townsend's force could not make any further progress. By 5 p.m.
I'm shocked that the Turks even managed to lose this, despite clearly having the advantage. I mean, but yeah, of course, the British will not be able to advance
He
anymore.
ordered his troops to break off action and retire for the night, having lost 4,600 men killed and wounded, over a quarter of his command. His officer ranks had been shattered. 130 of the 371 British officers had been killed or wounded, and half of the 255 Indian officers likewise.
Jeez, bro, I mean, it's mad, but like, yo, what do you expect, man?
They simply crammed as many wounded soldiers as possible onto 2 steamers, which were ordered to sail all the way back to Basra, which they finally arrived at on the 17th of December, 23 days after the battle. With little shelter from the sun or rain, let alone medical support, and dysentery rife, people later said that they could smell the 2 boats long before they could see them at Basra. And when medical teams
Oh, bro, that is mad.
went aboard, they had difficulty climbing over the dead to reach the living. maggots crawled over wound dressings and open wounds.
Oh,
that's disgusting. And quite frankly, it was nothing short of a scandal in 1915.
That's so disgusting.
Meanwhile, what was happening back up the river? With his small force having suffered over a 25% casualty rate, Townsend calculated that there was no way he could seize, let alone hold, Baghdad, and he ordered his men to retire back down the river to Kut to await reinforcements. As fate would have it, having lost 9,500 of his own men killed or wounded, the Ottoman commander had also ordered his troops to withdraw. So he was somewhat surprised to hear from his scouts that the British and Indian army were now in retreat, and despite his own losses, he now turned his forces around and gave chase.
I mean, yeah, obviously, that's the logical thing to do.
And his men arrived at Kut on the 3rd of December 1915, having covered the last 44 miles in 36 hours. Kut was a featureless town in a loop on the Tigris River. Most of the houses were made from mud, and while some were two-storey, the highest building was the tiny mosque. The streets had
mud, what?
No drainage, and when the rains came, became a stinking, slippery bog. Around 6,000 Arabs lived in the town. As an aside, the Arabs in Mesopotamia had not greeted the British army as liberators, but with a sullen resentment of exchanging one colonial master for another.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because the Arabs were also colonial at their peak. They were also colonial masters as well. But it's true, right? It's funny. I see like these ultra nationalist Turks in my comments, and when I say Turks, I don't just mean like Turkish people. I mean like Turk, like Turkic people, right? Including like Central Asian Turks as well, right? And I don't know, I've never really had anyone from the Caucasus, like Azerbaijan, comment on my videos before, so whatever. But no, I always see these ultra-nationalist Turkic people always like to... I literally read one of these comments yesterday, I was like, I don't feel like responding to this. Who always like to bring up the fact that, Britain was a colonial overlord, blah blah. You know the jazz, the drill, what they say. Want. Britain was a colonial power. Want. Britain bad. Want. Because Britain was a colonial power. Blah blah blah. You know it. I don't even feel like repeating myself because you already know it. When we have the Ottoman Empire, which is literally also a colonial power too, right? I literally had like Turkish people, like actual Turkish people, not Turkic people, like Turkish people, right? From like Turkey itself, like commenting how, the Ottoman Empire was a much better colonial overlord than Britain like a couple days ago. Oh my goodness, bro. Can't make this up. At the end of the day, it was still a colonial power. Alright? Plain and straight. And it's the Arabs here who I will play devil's advocate and say they were indeed indigenous to that region. So I wouldn't say that they colonized that region, but they were indigenous to that region. Okay, but it's the Arabs here who didn't really... Clearly, if you take what he said is true, the Arabs didn't really fancy the Ottoman Empire, right? So clearly, things were not sunshine and rainbows. Let's continue.
Informed Nixon that he intended to stand and fight. And with his force of 7,400 infantry, which included a contingent of West Kents who'd been sent up to join him, and a further 3,500 non-combatants and camp followers, Townsend was confident that he could hold the Turks at bay until relieved by fresh troops due to be arriving in Basra. On the 7th of December, the Turks launched their first infantry attack on the town. Advancing to within 400 yards of their lines, the British and Indian defenders were amazed to see the Turks fling themselves to the ground and start digging trenches at a speed that was almost superhuman. They were to dig 31 miles of trenches around Kut before the siege ended.
Wait, what? Wait. Hold on a second. Skip this part if you have to. Did I hear that correctly?
Miles of trench feet that was almost super ground is to see the Turks advancing to within 400 yards of their lines. The British and Indian defenders were amazed to see the Turks fling themselves to the ground and start digging trenches at a speed that was almost superhuman.
Damn!
They had to dig 31 miles of trenches around Kut before the siege ended. 3 days later, the 10th of December, the Turks launched 4 ferocious frontal attacks on Kut. The British defenders fired 61,000 rounds of ammunition as the attackers were beaten off with heavy casualties. And then on Christmas Eve, the 103rd Marathas, the 119th Infantry and the Oxfords, who were holding a fort on the right of the British line in the town, came under fire. The Turkish attackers managed to actually break into the fort, but were driven back in hand-to-hand fighting that lasted nearly an hour.
Damn!
Beaten off in the early hours of Christmas Day. Of the 30 men from the Oxfordshire Regiment in the fort, only 7 emerged unscathed. Meanwhile, the Marathas had lost 103 men killed and wounded, and the 119th Infantry another 63. Turkish losses were estimated at 2,000, with the Turkish officer recording 900 dead. There was now a lull in the fighting, and the garrison managed to enjoy some seasonal festivities, including a Christmas dinner. And as the year closed, the British and Indian troops looked forward to their imminent relief. On the 10th of December, General Sir Fenton Aylmer had arrived from India to command a relief force spearheaded by the 7th Indian Division, which included British regulars from the Seaforth Highlanders, the Black Watch and the Leicestershires, as well as regiments like the 53rd Punjabis and the Jats from India. But his relief plan was not going well. The so-called Port of Basra was in complete chaos, with absolutely no port management in place. The Indian 7th Division, who would spearhead that relief, had arrived from seeing action on the Western Front, only to find that their transport wagons, medical ambulances and other equipment like wire cutters, signal guns and periscopic rifles were somewhere on a ship between Marseille in France and Basra.
Yeah.
Making the best of a bad job, General Aylmer moved his relief column forward on the 5th of January. During the rest of the month, his relief expedition suffered nearly 8,000 casualties as they tried to break through, but to no avail. With no relief of Kut in sight, General Nixon's head rolled, and he was replaced by General Sir Percy Lake. Meanwhile, life in Kut was starting to get more desperate. Constant artillery bombardments and sniper activity was combined with falling food supplies and horrific weather. Now, it's easy to think of a war in the Middle East of being fought in hot, arid desert a la Lawrence of Arabia. But the truth in Mesopotamia is that the winters can be bitterly cold, and the regular rainfall turned the trenches on both sides into something similar to the Western Front. The water-sodden and then freezing trenches resulted in frostbite and gangrene of both fingers and toes. By Christmas, 1,140 sick and wounded were crowded into the hospital. And apart from that obvious strain on medical resources and beds, the doctors were short-staffed as 3 of their number had been killed in the siege and a further 2 died from disease. By the end of January, with food supplies dwindling, Townsend was reduced to killing the garrison's horses for meat, a move that was met by horror by the majority of his Indian troops on religious grounds.
Oh, ooh. Oh, yeah, that's the problem that you get when you have mixed regiments like this. But hey, it's Britain. They don't care.
Consequently, scurvy now broke out amongst those non-horse-eating troops, and by mid-February, 150 cases had been reported.
$25 a month.
Maybe not surprising that these privations, along with the siege conditions themselves and no sign of relief, lowered morale amongst many Indian troops. And added to this, Turkish leaflets appeared in the town, denouncing British rule in India and asking why the Muslim troops in the 6th Division were fighting for non-believers. Throughout the siege...
Oh, hit him with the facts though. Oh my goodness gracious me. But like seriously though, like why were the Indians fighting for the British? That still kind of makes my head like go. I don't even know. It's because seriously, like why were the Indians fighting for the British? Like what reason did they have? Because like I know how Britain colonized India. There's a lot of misconception of how Britain colonized India. It wasn't as gruesome and brutal as people think, really and truly. But it's like what would I mean, like I know the Indians were like hoping for. I think the Indians were fighting because they were like hoping for independence. Some of them were fighting for personal stuff, like what your average person nowadays join the military for, usually like benefits and whatnot. But like seriously though, that is a very good question. Like I'm saying this as someone who's a Christian myself. I'm just being objectively true. Like why would the Indians fight for the British, right? Because if you put in comparison, the West Indies Regiment, which were also fighting against the Ottoman Empire, the West Indies Regiment was basically the British Caribbean regiment. They were fighting in Egypt, and with that, it's like, okay, yeah, you could see that because the way how the Caribbean was colonized, it was like it wasn't really like gruesome. And even with slavery, it's like, dude, slavery happened everywhere, right? So it's like that wasn't really as bad, really and truly. So it's like, and a lot of these places, due to the small nature of the islands, had so much influence from their European overlords that it obviously would become just kind of like small enclaves of each respective European overlord. So the people who grew up there obviously would have that sense of identity, quite frankly speaking. Some islands were different, of course. Like I know, like Jamaica was distinct in it that Jamaica had a successful slave revolt with the Maroon people who successfully fought the British. So because of that, the Jamaicans didn't really like completely assimilate into European culture and ways of life and whatnot. So it's kind of like, but even though Jamaica still had a good, strong British and other European, because Jamaica was originally Spanish, of course, but there was still a profound influence there. So the people there, again, it wasn't really like bad. Like after slavery, things were relatively just calm in the Caribbean, really and truly. There was no oppression or any systemic racism or anything like that. It was relatively calm. So it's like yeah, I get that, but with India, it's like that's so. Damn, I'm trying to like wrap my head around this. Like I know that there were Indians that were proud of fighting for the crown. Don't get me wrong, very much so, they were. But like, didn't Britain treat India a lot worse though? Well, Britain did, and they also didn't. So okay, India is a continental country as well, so it's like it's very hard to talk about. Unless I'm missing some info, because the thing with British colonization is, due to the whole goal of British colonization, which was basically trade, it's like it always was not as gruesome as people would think. Now, I remember there was this one Pakistani girl that I met, and she told me that like half of her family were like freaking murdered by the British. And she told me a story about that. How they were all murdered in a room. Now, I know that. But that's the thing, it's like, but it always wasn't like that. So it's like, I don't know. That is such a good question. Why are Indians fighting for the British Empire? I need to go read some books on British rule in India. I feel like I'm missing some stuff here. I feel like I am. Because I know the way how Britain colonized India was that they basically convinced like local Indian princes to basically like, well, the British East India Company, anyway, convinced local Indian princes to join, be like basically become puppet states of that company until the crown came, and those Indian princes essentially become puppet states of the crown, essentially like vassal states, basically. So they were still rulers of, you know, their princely states, but obviously, like any medieval vassalage system, yes, they were still rulers, but they had to answer to the crown. So I guess you could say that these Indians here were, due to that system, they still had princes that they were fighting for. I guess you could say that. I don't know, but the way how Britain treated Indians though were low key like kind of I mean, even then, like after slavery was abolished in Caribbean, for example, right? Britain replaced that with Indian. What the hell is it? Indian. I would call it Indian slavery, but the official name was Indian servitude. Indentured servants. Yeah. And that was gruesome. That was gruesome. Like a lot of these Indians were taken from their homes and they were freaking sent to the Caribbean thinking that they would be able to get back home. And yeah, they never were able to get back home. It's a lot of heartbreaking stories about that, right? Yeah. And they weren't paid great. That's why it's basically Indian slavery. Indentured servitude is literally slavery. Like I swear I see people who like to be all technical and say, oh, but technically chattel slavery. You're like, yes, I know chattel slavery is different, but indentured servitude is literally just slavery in a different form. Might not be as gruesome, but it was still gruesome. This is not a game of which one is much more bad than the other. If it's gruesome and bad, it's gruesome and bad. End of story. But yeah, that's why actually because of that, there's actually a lot of Indian people, Kool-Aid men. We call them in the Caribbean. We call them Kool-Aid men. Yeah, there's a good chunk of Indian ancestry, including myself. I have Indian ancestry as well because of that. Well, I don't know if it is because of that, but most likely it is probably because of that. My great grandmother was like pure Indian. I actually asked my mother about that actually, and because I had someone point it out, and he looked at me, and he was like, "You're black. But you're not black. Like you seem to have some type of other ancestry, most likely from Asia, most likely somewhere from Asia, aside from just black and white." And I was like, that's actually a good point. So I actually went to my mom. I actually asked her about that, and she said, yeah. She's like, your great grandmother on my side, she told me she was like a pure Indian, and she said like when she met her, they looked at her. She was like a kid, obviously. It's my great grandmother, obviously, but they looked at her. Like my other family members, obviously, I don't know them, but she was just telling me the story of how when she first saw her, You know, like the Caribbean people. Caribbean people are either usually white, black, or mixed between the two. But there's sometimes, like I said before, there can be other like races, like Indian people. But yeah, when she first saw her, they were like, "Yeah, she's one of us." Yeah, they like, don't let her look deceive you. She's one of us. And then she said that she looked over and she saw this like super freaking completely different looking person that was completely Indian. And they were like, yeah, she's one of us. Like saying that she's like one of the Caribbean folks, you know. So and she was like surprised by that. And she said, yeah, because of that, she said you most likely probably just took some of her genes, which is true. It's funny because people, when they see me, like I'm growing out my hair. And because of this, it deceives people, right? It deceives people a lot. But my mom even looked at me and she told me this. She's like, if I had to cut my hair out, she said my hair would actually look like a Kool-Aid man, like an Indian person here. She said it wouldn't look black. Like if I actually like cut all this off, she said you would actually see like your real hair. Cause she said when I was born, my hair didn't really like look like this. She said it was much more different than this. She's been begging me to cut my hair, and I'm like, no, I'm not cutting my hair. I probably eventually will cut my hair. I want to see if I can curl it out first. But she said that if I do curl it out, like my curls will be like not like black, not like black person curl, but like she said it'd be more like Kool-Aid man, like Indian type of style. So yeah, it's kind of funny whenever I see people in my comments type like stupid racist rage bait comments. I'm like, bro, I'm not as black as you think I am. And even then, it's like my skin color, it actually looks more like an Indian person. The only reason why I don't look like yellow is because of my Indian genetics. Had I not have those Indian genetics, I would look more like yellow. But due to my Indian genetics, my skin tone is like yellow, but it's kind of like brownish, and sometimes I look orange. Now, if you've been watching my videos long enough, you'll see my skin tone tend to fluctuate, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Anyways, let's continue.
There was a trickle of Indian soldiers deserting or wounding themselves with self-inflicted injuries. As the weather warmed with the approach of spring, British and Indian defenders had to cope with sandflies, whose sting felt like a hot needle, lice infestations, and swarms of flies. What with the Tigris River overflowing and flooding the trenches and large parts of the town, and a plague of green frogs, it was like something out of the Old Testament. And that was without the putrid stink of hundreds of dead Turkish bodies in no man's land. Finally, on the 8th of March, General Aylmer, suitably reinforced, launched his next long-awaited assault. But once more, after nearly 20 hours of fighting, he failed to dislodge the Turks, whilst losing nearly 3,500 men. A further attempt to break through the Turkish lines at Sansiat ended in failure, and once more heavy losses, 3,000. It was now time for Aylmer's head to roll, and he was replaced as commander of the relief expedition by Major General George Gorringe. The situation in Kut was now getting desperate. Townsend reduced the rations of his garrison to 5 ounces of barley per man per day, plus additional 1 pound of horse meat for those who would eat it. In these dire circumstances, many of his Indian troops finally decided to eat the horse meat, but for many, it was too little too late. The non-meat-eating Indian troops were dying at a rate of 15 a day. Scurvy was still the most common complaint, but the hospital was also struggling with cases of dysentery, malaria, pneumonia, diarrhoea, beriberi, especially among British troops, bronchitis, jaundice, and gastroenteritis. It was now that General organised the first ever drop of supplies to a besieged garrison from the air. Unlike Kohima and Imphal and the Berlin blockade, however, the results had little effect. Inaccurate drops, poor weather, and interception by German fighters hampered this early effort at air supply. The 9 British planes flew 140 missions and dropped 19,000 pounds of food, but it was nowhere near enough. In a final attempt to get supplies through to the town, a steamer, renamed HMS Jula, had attempted to break through the blockade on the river, but it got stranded and became a sitting duck for the Turkish gunners. Both the captain and the first officer were to be awarded posthumous Victoria Crosses.
Do you know what's really...
General Townsend now requested that General Lake enter into negotiations with the Turkish commander Halil Pasha. Lake suggested that as the gallant defender of Kut, Townsend might be able to receive better terms if he negotiated directly, which may have been so, but then it also meant that history would not record Lake as the man who surrendered Kut, would it? He did, however, send 2 intelligence officers to assist in the negotiations. Aubrey Herbert, a Member of Parliament who had been offered the crown of Albania a few years beforehand, and T.E. Lawrence, who would later become famous as Lawrence of Arabia. But their assistance came to nothing. Townsend's appeal for a parole, in other words an honourable withdrawal whilst agreeing not to fight the Turks again in the war, was refused by Halil Pasha. It was complete surrender or nothing. And so, having destroyed all his guns and rifles, Townsend surrendered his garrison on the 29th of April 1916. It was the biggest surrender in the British Army's history since Yorktown, over 130 years beforehand. During the 140-day siege of Kut, the British Indian Army had lost just over 1,700 men, of whom 700 had died of starvation or disease. Of the 1,450 sick and wounded at Kut, just over 1,000 were exchanged for Turkish prisoners and sent downstream. Later, with the aid of the US consul, a further 350 were repatriated from Baghdad. On the 6th of May, the defeated garrison, many without boots, began their long march into captivity far to the north in Anatolia, well over 1,000 kilometres away. Marching up to 24 kilometres a day with little water or shade and subjected to frequent beatings by their guards, they were even stoned by locals as they marched through the town of Tikrit.
Say what you want, but the British didn't treat their POWs like this. You might notice how, like, all these people that, like, these people like to complain about, like, these European colonial empires. You ever, like, notice how they never really treat their POWs in wars bad? I've never really heard of that. I mean, if there is a case of that, I mean, tell me, but where? I, like, genuinely, I've never heard of like POWs being treated bad by like European colonial powers. I'm talking about like major colonial powers, by the way. Like, for example, Britain and France. When Britain took when they took prisoners in World War One, they never treated them. I never heard of Turks being treated bad in British captivity, or France treating their POWs bad. But when it's always the other way around, it's much different.
Over 4,000 British and Indian POWs died on this death march or in the camps.
Bro.
1,700 or 70% died or were never heard of again. Of the Indians, about 1,300 were known to have died, although numbers of survivors cannot be exact, as even as late as 1924, ex-POWs were turning up in their villages in India. Townsend did not suffer the same deprivations as his men. The Turks removed him to Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, where he was kept prisoner in relative comfort. He died back in Britain in 1924. During the 4 months of the siege, 23,000 men of the relief force had either been killed or wounded trying to break through. That's twice as many men as were in the besieged garrison that they were trying to rescue. Whatever way you cut it, for the British, the Indians, and the Allied cause, the siege of Kut had been a disaster in the desert. But of course, For the Turks, on the heels of Gallipoli, it was yet another victory. History always has at least two perspectives, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I was gonna say, obviously, the Turks would be extremely proud of this victory, and rightfully so. Rightfully so. I mean, this victory legit stopped the advance from Baghdad, like altogether. Pretty much at this point, anyways, because Turkey would eventually kind of still get train wrecked in the First World War, especially in the Palestine theater. So, I mean, still though, it was a great victory. Nonetheless, it was extremely stupid for the British to even try to advance on Baghdad being outnumbered and not expecting to have horrific casualties. Do not know what the British were thinking, but this whole thing could have been avoided had the British, use basic common sense, really and truly. But it is what it is, really and truly. But anyways, if you have any suggestions for me, comment down below. If you like my reactions on what I have to say, definitely subscribe. I am probably one of the more quality reactors in this niche compared to other people. I watch other people just to see my competitors. I watch their reactions and they react to the same stuff as me, and their personalities are so dull. I'm just better. Okay? Or I should say that in my American accent. I'm just better. Anyways, man, make sure you go like and subscribe. Go check out my other reactions on my channel. Thank you for watching.